Hey everyone, and welcome back to Good Till Canceled. This week we have our second video in our retirement mini series. This week's video is titled Building Your Retirement Income Plan. We wanted to put this one in there. We do have a lot of clients when they get closer to retirement, always asking about retirement income. And it is a very crucial thing to worry about because in retirement you stop working. Therefore, you have a need to replace your income, right, in order to live. So I think we have a really good video today. Again, if you're not subscribed to our channel yet, please make sure you like and subscribe. That way you get notifications when the next video pops up in our mini series. Without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing, I'm just going to put up a graphic here. We're just going to talk about the 5 factors when building a retirement income plan. First one, obviously, is the probably hardest one is estimate how much you actually need per year in retirement, right? So that's estimating your annual expenses, like what you need to live on a daily basis. And also, make sure you include some of your goals in there, right? If you're going to travel, large purchases, buying homes, golf, etc. These are all things you want to plan for. And, we'll talk about that a little bit further down. But number 2, we see there, consider some of the major factors. Chris will go over them today as well. Some of the things like inflation, longevity, all that stuff to consider. Number 3, add up your guaranteed income. So those are things like your Social Security, your pensions, your annuities. We'll go over that as well. Number 4, identify the gap. We'll talk about what the gap is, but it's pretty simple. It's what your expenses are minus your income. Which brings us to our last part of the retirement income plan, which is bridging that gap. And we'll talk about how we do that. So first one here, estimating your income need, right? Usually, again, like I said, it becomes one of the hardest things for a lot of our clients to do because it's really hard to track expenses, right? But we all have different bank accounts, different credit cards, monthly subscriptions. So use the years leading up to retirement to really hone in on what you're actually spending. You can use bank and credit card statements, right? Compile them at the end of the year, go through them, add them up, keep an Excel sheet, keep a notebook, whatever makes it easier, but try and just get a ballpark number of what your annual expenses are.
And this kind of goes back to last video we were saying, right? One of the things we mentioned was starting to consolidate accounts. Yes. So this makes it just that much easier for you to really track those expenses, right?
Correct. Yeah. Start consolidating some of them. Having 5 different bank accounts and 3 different credit cards is going to make it really hard, and ongoing, monthly subscriptions that are coming out automatically, ACH payments, that's the stuff that can really eat away over the long term. Right. We also have, I know that Chris, we had talked about this, but one of the things they always mention, at least in the CFP board training, is to plan for 70 to 80% of your current today expenses you need in retirement, right? We, on the other hand, we typically like to plan for 100%, right? Because in our experience, I don't necessarily know that your expenses you're going to be able to cut 20% of your expenses in retirement, right? Because what are you really spending less money on, right? Maybe gas, but what do you have an abundance of in retirement? Time.
Right.
What do you need you're going to need to fill that time with something, and some things cost money, whether it's
I think that's a good point, and I'd rather always err on the side of caution as well. When we want to, even when we're using return numbers and, other inputs, we try to, err on the side of being too conservative and too aggressive. So the conservative side on this case would be just using 100% of whatever your expenses are. Yeah. And if you, cut back on your expenses, that's one of the things that we'll talk about that helps to bridge the gap if there is a gap, cutting those expenses. But if you don't, then it's just, you've already just planned and you already have that money saved up. So it's better off for you.
Yeah. And that's, maintaining your lifestyle is something I always preach to my clients, right? And that's what we really want to do. Because I've always said it, spenders are going to spend, savers are going to save. It's going to be really hard to go into retirement and your plan has you spending 80% of what you're spending now. It's going to be really hard to find that 20% to cut. And, another thing I wanted to include in this section is I'm going to put this chart up. It's from JP Morgan's Guide to Retirement. it shows the median spending across all age groups, broken down into, travel, apparel, entertainment, other. And you'll see that the peak spending years are around age 45, and they do taper off as you get older. And what's interesting about this chart, though, is you can kind of see where they're broken down in retirement, right? So number one, obviously, housing is the number one expense, and it remains constant throughout, right? Because that's just the way it is. Homes are expensive, mortgages are expensive, and we always have them. We always need a roof over our heads, right? The things that do go up, the only two things that actually go up in retirement are healthcare, which is expected, and charitable contributions, another thing that can be expected. So those are the two that increase. Everything slightly tapers off as they get older. And then how obviously remains constant as the number one expense.
Yeah, I think this chart is so interesting because it's amazing to me that travel, apparel and services, entertainment, transportation, food and beverage are all lower in retirement for people than they were when they weren't retired.
Yeah.
I just feel like, what are people doing when they're retired? Like is no one really traveling when they're retired? I feel like that's such a big thing for people to say they want to travel when they're retired, and then just looks like no one's actually doing it. No one's actually going out to eat or having, golfing. I guess that would fall under entertainment or.
Yeah, I think maybe it goes back to the psychology of humans, right? Where everyone says, "Oh, I'm going to travel in retirement," but if you never did travel, you probably also won't travel in retirement, right? That's just the way, people don't typically change in retirement, right? That the saver save, the spender spend. If you traveled a lot before retirement, you're probably going to travel in retirement. But if you didn't travel a lot, I think it's harder for you as a human to kind of put your mind to that and actually go out and do it.
Right. I guess it's not a big difference, but I mean, it's even tapered off. So you would think the number would at least stay the same if that was true, right? The people that were traveling, keep traveling, and if not, but it is interesting to see kind of what people are spending their money on in retirement. It's kind of bleak too, I guess. All you're doing is paying for your house and giving away your money or paying for your healthcare costs.
Yeah. I mean, you can see at the end there, it's about 70% of your expenses, it looks like, almost, are healthcare, housing, and charitable contributions. So you just
please save up, everyone, to just enjoy your retirement.
Enjoy it. That's what we work for our whole lives, right? What's the purpose?
Right.
So, all right. Well, so that kind of covers that first cog in the 5 factors of retirement. We'll move on to the second one, which is obviously just considering all the different factors that go into retirement planning.
Right. So we want to be cognizant of different things that are going to affect what income you're going to need in retirement. And that's going to help you kind of figure out that number that bridges the gap number. So, right, we want to be aware of what are the biggest factors that are going to affect you in retirement, right? It's going to be inflation's one, right? So, and that's just regular inflation, the cost of everyday goods. Alex has in here the 70-year average for inflation is 3.7%. Obviously, over the last 20 years, that number has been a lot lower, but it's still been around 2. Over the last 10 years, it's been a little less than 2. But I mean, you can expect that number to be at least 2 to 3%. And then you look at healthcare inflation, and that number is even higher. That continues to trend higher. And then, in addition to inflation, right, we want to make sure that we're earning enough money above and beyond inflation so that our dollars are actually worth the same every year. Individuals are living longer too. So you're retiring if you retire at 65 and you're married, there's a 33% chance that you or your spouse are going to live at least another 30 years, right? So that's 30 years is a long-term time horizon. So you don't want to be too conservative. So also, if you have to know yourself and that there's longevity in your family, you have to account for that. If there's not, I think you still want to account for it being, obviously you want to take care of yourself and factor in that maybe you will, live longer, just with the healthcare services that are available to people nowadays. So those are factors that you really want to consider when you're moving into retirement, getting ready for retirement, and when you're actually in retirement. Did I miss anything there, Alex?
No, and we'll put that chart up just, for the heck of it, just showing the long-term CPI, right? Just showing you that inflation can be high, right? Obviously, it hasn't been, like Chris mentioned, in the past 20 years, but there are periods in our history where it gets high, and we're talking 10, 15, 20% in some instances, right? And those are obviously one-offs, but inflation, even low, 2 to 3% inflation over a 30-year period can be devastating to your retirement if you don't plan properly, right? So if you're not invested in the things that are going to offset inflation over the long term, and you're in, short-term instruments like cash and things that don't yield a lot, those are going to get eaten away over 30 years, right? Things today, cost of things today will cost a lot more 30 years from now. It's just how it works, right? 30 years from, if you go back 30 years in history from now, a house was, $16,000 or whatever, like it's
Right. And the fact is that inflation will pick up in different areas at different times. So picture a retiree that's obviously retired right now, right? What if they needed to buy a new car? New cars have been are hard to find, and they're expensive now. Even used cars are selling for more than they were originally purchased for. So inflation picks up in different areas at different times, and it's not all just one thing. It's again, like if you needed to buy a car right now, that car costs a lot more than it did 3 years ago. So you have to be cognizant of that. That you can't really, if you need a car, especially in retirement, you can't really just put off not buying a car. So you have to factor these things in and earn a rate of return that's better than inflation, and hopefully, a fair amount better than inflation.
Yep. Yeah. All right. So obviously you want to take, we figure out our expenses. Now we're going to grow them by inflation every year. And now we're going to move on to the third piece, which is adding up the guaranteed income that we have, right? So guaranteed income, obviously the number one that I'm talking about is Social Security. When it comes to Social Security in retirement, when you take it matters, right? I'm going to put up a chart here that's going to show, obviously when you take Social Security earlier, you're accepting a reduced benefit off of what you're promised at full retirement age. So for instance, at age 62, you're going to only get 75% of your entitled benefit, right? At age 63, you're going to get 80, right? 64, 86.6, 65, 93.3. And right now, full retirement age is actually 67, but for this, we're going to show 66. That's when you get 100% of your full retirement benefit.
Right.
Every year beyond that grows by 8%. And right now, I always say this to people, that is the only 8% guarantee that exists, right? Out there. Something, having a benefit or an asset like Social Security that's going to grow by 8% and guaranteed every year, that's the only, thing that exists in that nature.
Right.
So sometimes thinking about putting it off as long as possible, you'll really see the benefit for it.
Right.
Another thing, yeah.
Right. There's various withdrawal strategies, right, that you can obviously talk to your advisor about to help maximize the amount that you can get, right?
For it, go talk to your advisor. For our clients, talk to us. We have a Social Security system. We can take yours, you and your spouses, if you're single, just yours, input it into the system. We can show you how to maximize your benefit over your expected, your life expectancy. So definitely talk to someone. Don't just go at this alone. Right. Another thing is to understand how your benefit is taxed. And again, I'm going to put another chart up there, but people don't often think about this. They see I'm going to get $3,200 a month from Social Security. That's showing you the benefit before it's taxed. Just like anything else in this world, when we receive something, when we buy something, whatever, the government's going to want a piece of it, right? That's how it works. So what for most people that are watching this, probably most of our clients, but it depends on what's called your provisional income, right? Which is your adjusted gross income plus the interest earned plus 50% of your Social Security benefit. If that falls under $32,000 if you're married, or $25,000 if you're single, your Social Security income is tax-free, right? If it falls in between 32 and 44, 50% of your Social Security benefit is taxable. And if it's more than 44,000, 85% of your benefit is taxable. And keep in mind, this is marginal, right? So if I have $50,000 in provisional income, the first 6,000 is taxed at 85, not taxed at 85%. 85% of that 6,000 is taxed at your tax rate. The rest is taxed at the 50% or 50% is taxed at it's very common. I understand.
And for those of you that weren't just taking notes right then, we will post a nice little picture of
Yes.
exactly what Alex was just referring to.
Yep. But anyway, moral of the story is it's going to be taxed. So keep that in mind. So that is, and then obviously the next one, pensions, right? Some people that are retiring now still have them. Maybe for the next 10 years, you'll see them here and there. Beyond that, you're really only going to see it in state and government officials. I think pensions are kind of going to be a thing of the past. But when it comes to your pension, again, understand your benefit, right? The benefit you're seeing most of the time is probably what's known as the straight life option, right? Which is the highest, that will give you your highest benefit. That means that when you die, your pension stops, right? Your monthly payments cease to exist. Your spouse gets, or your beneficiaries get nothing. The lowest will probably be the joint 100% survivor, meaning that when you die, your spouse will continue the payments for as long as they live. So make sure you're looking at all these different options and evaluating what's best for you, and know which one you're going to choose when you actually put it in, for the input into your planning, right? Don't just take the highest number and assume that's the one you're going to want to go with, right? So, and again, some of the pensions are taxed, right? So keep that in mind.
Beware of taxes always.
There's always taxes. So, all right, let's move on to the next piece, which is identifying the gap.
Yeah, this is an easy one, right? We talked about knowing what your expenses are, understanding what your income is going to be in retirement, and then obviously just the difference between the two is going to be the gap that you're going to need to fund in retirement, right? So we already talked about the idea of expenses and probably just using 100% of whatever your current expenses are now, all of your, adding up all of your income, Social Security, factoring taxes, pensions, annuity income, what have you, anything that you're expecting moving forward. And then the difference between the two is what you need to make the shortfall, which is what you need to make up with your investments during retirement, right? So there's a few, moving on to the next, after you've identified the gap, right, we have to bridge the gap. So we have to get over the gap, or we have to fund the gap somehow, right? So how do you do that, right? There's a few different strategies. We've talked about it numerous times on the show, the 4% withdrawal rule, which is really just a rule of thumb, just saying that basically you're going to withdraw 4% of your assets in the initial year of retirement, and then that should serve as a good, foundation of being able to withdraw your assets safely over your life expectancy. And that's using a balanced portfolio of stocks and bonds, and then also being adjusted for inflation, right? So there's a couple things with this that we've talked about, right? This is based on past returns, and past returns may not be indicative of future returns. So obviously we've been in a pretty strong bull market, just an equity bull market. We've been in an even longer bond bull market. A lot of people expect returns to moderate in the future, so maybe you don't expect the same returns moving forward, and that 4% rule maybe isn't 4% anymore. Maybe it's a little bit less. Also, when you retire also matters, so that 4% rule can kind of go out the window if you happen to retire February 19th of 2020, and then all of a sudden your assets decrease by 35% because of the COVID crash. Now that's a little bit extreme example because the market also bounced right back. But let's say, again, you retired in 2000 and then the market declined by 45% with the dot-com bubble, and it took quite a while to return back to even. And while you're taking assets out during that time period, that can obviously, you're taking assets out while the market's declining, you have less assets to really go back up. So your account won't last as long just taking the same amount over and over. Really, the 4% rule is just a basic starting point for you, right? So it just gives you a rough idea of how good am I doing, right? If you're just, you find you're left with a lot of money at the end of 30 years, and you're probably, well off. And if you find that you're running out of money when you're 75, then we probably need to look at your plan and adjust some spending, or count on working a few more years, right? Another approach, right, is going to be similar to the 4% withdrawal rule, is one of my favorites, like the bucket approach. So this is basically just bucketing your assets in different styles of investments to account for what your liquidity needs and your time horizons and, you know, income gap estimates, right? So for example, if you figured out that you had a $10,000 a year income gap, right, where you needed to fund $10,000 out of your investments a year, you could have $50,000 worth of very risk-free, safe investments to fund 5 years of your income gap for the next 5 years, right? And then you can have another bucket that's maybe a more balanced portfolio of stocks and fixed income and alternative assets. And then you can have a kind of another bucket of very long-term growth assets that you're not going to touch for, you know, you're not really going to need for the next 30 years, but are there and really allowed to grow. So as you take money out of the risk-free bucket or the very safe bucket, right, you fund that bucket with assets from the more balanced portfolio or the higher risk bucket, right? So it kind of gives people a little bit for me, it makes me feel a little bit more calm about my investments. It, you know, helps me internalize where things are. I don't get, you know, I know that I have the money set aside for 5 years, so I'm really able to focus on the long term and I don't make any kind of rash decisions. We've seen statistics that, you know, on a rolling 5-year calendar basis, if you're 100% equities, the worst return on a rolling 5-year calendar basis has been -1% over the last 70 years or 50 years. So I think, you know, obviously taking the time horizon out a little bit further, you're allowed to take a little bit more risk. So that's why having that safe bucket really makes a lot of sense. Some other options, of course, are going to include spending less, right? So you can not spend as much, so that'll help kind of fund that gap. You can also just retire later, right? That also helps. You can work during retirement, work part-time. So maybe, you know, retirement's not just sitting around all day. Maybe you're working part-time at whatever kind of, you know, hobby that you have. Also lowering investment costs is a big thing, right? So, you know, being as efficient as possible with investments. And then the final thing is just, you can also purchase, you know, income riders, guaranteed annuities, things that are going to provide you income moving forward, right?
Yep.
So those are all options to really help bridge that gap.
Yep. Yeah. So at the end of the day, obviously what you want to do is, you know, you're using your assets to bridge the gap, right? And that's the reason we have 401ks and IRAs and taxable accounts, and why we save money is we're going to have our guaranteed income. We're going to have our expenses. Our expenses are going to grow by inflation every year, right? Your income, your guaranteed income, unfortunately, it will grow by cost of living, but it probably won't keep up with inflation over the long term. You know, Social Security does get adjusted every year, but again, it's not much. Your assets are going to be needed to be invested in things that do offset inflation over the long term in order to bridge that gap and fill that void, right? It's to supplement your income in retirement. Again, that's all we have for today. Next week, we are going to go more in depth into withdrawal strategies, which again, I've told Chris about this. It's a very complicated subject that people have written books about. People have gotten PhDs in it. There is science involved. There's a lot to talk about with the actual withdrawal strategies in retirement, right? So I think that will be a very good in-depth video. Please, again, like and subscribe so you know when we post that video. And we really appreciate you guys watching.
Thanks, guys.